On with the formality. So hello to all of you and welcome. My name's Kate Colvin. I'm the CEO of Homelessness Australia, the national peak body for homelessness. Before we kick off or as part of kicking off the proceedings for the launch of Homelessness Week, can I introduce Uncle Michael West from the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, who's going to give us a welcome to country. Michael was born, raised and has lived his whole life in Sydney's Aboriginal communities. He's a member of the Stolen Generations, and he's had a variety of previous roles, so many, my goodness, this is incredibly impressive. He's the director of the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network, a co-chair of the National Sorry Day Committee, a delegate at the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, a member of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Board of Headspace, and a cultural advisor to TEDx in Sydney. A warm welcome to Michael.
I'd like to say Bujadi Gamarua Gada Galiora and good day and welcome everyone. The different roles I've had, I think I would put it, colloquial terms, I'm jack of things not being done right, one might say. And we need voices out there that are going to speak the truth and to be taking on those tough conversations that we need to have. I was going to say here in Sydney, obviously where we are, we have one of the most beautiful harbours in the world. We have here where we are is Gadigal, down there at the Opera House. Jabbagali is what it's called down there, and where the Opera House was an island there, and we had middens, and the middens are actually taken, and they're actually part of the infrastructure here in Sydney. So they're over at Tullawallada, which is the rocks. If you go down to Argyle Street and some of the old buildings down there, the wharfs, the warehouses, and you look in the mortar, you'll see little specks of shell. Also like at the Mint too, in Macquarie Street and other places there. I was going to say, with homelessness, we really shouldn't be having homelessness in Australia, should we? No, we're a very rich first world country. We should be providing... Home should be actually part of human rights, I think, is what it is. It should be. And that everyone should have a stable home, a stable house, so they can concentrate on other things like their education. And also when you think about it, housing also affects your health. If you don't have stable housing, then how can you really have a healthy life, which impacts on your education, therefore your career that you want to have, and follow the path and the journey that you need to. I was going to say too, I was just at New South Wales Parliament and we were having a yarn about mental health and health. And when you think about it, health is not just mental and physical, it's a holistic approach we need to, and that is impacted by people being homeless. When you think about it, we have mental, physical, cultural, spiritual, community, country, and emotional health, and they all interact with each other and they all play out on the individual. Now, I was going to say too, it's important to connect with Mother Earth. Mother Earth, I think for the last few years when we've been going through this pandemic, we've realised that how important it is just to get outside amongst the trees, amongst the birds, amongst the animals, and just connect with them. And for Aboriginal people, connecting with Mother Earth and country is so important. Like our totems, we lost many a few years ago with those firestorms. We lost more than 1 billion, as I understand, totems, which are important to us. And totems to us are a spiritual connection, but they're also family. So when the whales would come in here, they don't as they do come in here sometimes into the harbour, but they used to come in here and rest down at Gomera, which is Darling Harbour, with their calves. So they would do that over many millennia. Unfortunately, we've created a space down there where they can't do that anymore. So they do come and venture into the bay, they do come into the harbour, but they don't like they did for many millennia. It's unfortunate, but they're part of the totems. They know that they're safe. Here. And then also they would part of the totems up and down with the different names up and down the coast from different language groups and tribes and nations. Also what I was going to say too is that over at Parramatta, Parramatta is actually named after the Barra clan, Barra meaning eel. In our language, we have double R's like a trill, Barra. So Barra is an eel, and Barra's created Sydney Harbour, and Barra's just resting off of East Balmain. There's a little island called Memel or Memel, also known as Goat Island, but its real name is Memel or Memel. And then what I was going to say, Barra is also a totem which migrates to the South Pacific, but also where Barra is, that's also a trading place. Just like Brewarrina Fish Traps is a trading place, where many different clans, tribes could come around and have a yarn, share some food and share some stories and learn and their connection to each other. What I was going to say, look, I'll get you guys to just look up one thing on your phone I think is important. To reinforce our interaction with the world, and I'm sure you'll find a very interesting picture. Look at Huntingbird Manuscript Vatican, and you'll see one of our totems there. And we did do trade up the top for many hundreds of years, and unfortunately it was stopped over 100 years ago. We traded with the Macassans, and I was on my way in here this morning, and I heard on Koori Radio they were talking to Macassan and an Aboriginal man. They were doing a project on the trade that was done there, and I was lucky to meet last year some aunties who were descendants of the traders up in the top end there. So we traded Macassans, Indonesia, and up into China and further afar. So what have you found there? What's the totem that you have found? You found a cockatoo, yes. So that's 13th century, 1241. One could only imagine the relationship we would have with China and Indonesia if we were allowed to continue our trade and sharing our yarns and stories. So do you think that's a good picture of the cockatoo? I think it's a good picture. What are cockatoos like? No, everyone says noisy is the first thing, I think. They are noisy. They're mischievous. They're cheeky. I know in my backyard when they are there, and they're there a lot, they will drop rocks for me to mow over. So I've always got to check. They drop pieces of fruit that one bite out of them, or not even a bite. And then they're on the tree and the trunk, and they're pulling part of the trunk off and throwing it down, making noises and that. But they're very beautiful animals. If you see them in probably 100 or 200 together, they are quite mischievous and they're going quite crazy. But I think that's a great depiction because it shows their attitude. Yes, in that picture, doesn't it? It clearly shows attitude. And what I was going to say, I saw that same picture in May earlier this year down at Carriage Works. What do you think I was at? Australian Fashion Week. The runway models have the same look on their face, one might say. They do, I can tell you. But we all need a little bit of a laugh in our lives, I think. As humans, we need that bit of laugh. We need connection. We need to have that time where we can look after ourselves, our own health and that. What I was going to say, there is a bird that I'm passionate about to get respected. It's got white feathers, black tail feathers, a long neck and a long beak. Yes, the ibis, the sacred ibis, just like in Egyptian culture, they have the sacred ibis. Please don't call me a bin chicken. I'm not a bin chicken. It's not my fault. We were discussing this with the elders the other day, that think about it. They've had a parallel journey with Aboriginal people. They've been displaced from country, they've had to move their city, and they're being blamed for their own situation they're in. Yes, if we think about these things like that. And they're a beautiful bird. I'm lucky to have them close to me, and I can watch them and their little families, their little community, and I've been lucky enough because I think I respect them that they had a young one in my front yard for 2 weeks in a nest, and the parents looking after it, keeping guard, and it had a very small beak. And then also, I've been lucky early this year to see an elder bird, one might say, taking 3 younger birds for flying lessons, doing circles and one way and banking the other way and doing figure eights. So it was wonderful, and I was thinking it's the older birds passing down their knowledge and skills onto the younger birds, which was great. Just like how we should be in society. Unfortunately, I did find one dead the other week out my yard. I think may have got hit by a car. So I did not throw him in the bin. I think that's disrespectful. So I took him out in the backyard, or her, in the backyard, and gave him a proper burial and said some few words over him, because they're now with their mob, because they stay where they are. So their spirit is now with their community and their family. So I think it's important to be respectful with all forms of life. I think it's important, and we need to be respectful to each other too. It's important we do take a moment's silence, pay respects to ancestors, pay respects to Mother Earth. We've had a couple of difficult years and we've lost people on the way. We need to remember them not as just numbers, people who have family, names, community, and their loved ones, and they had their own ambitions as we do. And also think about Mother Earth. Mother Earth provides us with everything. We need to really care for her and really connect with her and that. So if you have a moment's silence, a moment of paying respects and a moment of reflection, thank you. We have three beautiful rivers, the Hawkesbury, Nepean, Georges, which are the aquatic bounds of our nation. On behalf of Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council members and elders, welcome everyone here. We also want to say that it's important that you have a safe stay, a safe journey home to your family and loved ones, and that let's create a society where no matter the postcode you're born in, the gender you identify, the colour of your skin, the shape of your eyes, and whether you have a disability or not, whether you're neurodiverse or not, you should be able to fulfil your dreams and aspirations. That's what we really want. So always was, always will be Aboriginal land never ceded. Let's have those tough conversations we need to have, and I'm sure that we need to be honest in the conversation about homelessness. I'll leave you with those thoughts. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael, for that very warm welcome to Gadigal country. On behalf of Homelessness Australia, I acknowledge that and pay deep respects to the traditional custodians of this country, to elders past, present and emerging, to all the First Nations people joining the event today, recognising that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Also acknowledge the ongoing impacts of colonisation and the stark overrepresentation of people, First Nations people, in Australia's homelessness numbers that flows from that colonisation history. So I'm very pleased to be here with you today with more than 500 people, mostly online, but also many in this room, to mark the launch of Homelessness Week 2024. Can I particularly acknowledge Dom Rowe and the team at Homelessness New South Wales who've partnered with us to bring you today's event and put up with my sometimes not awesome logistical skills. A shout out to my board members who are in the room today, to Francis Crimmins, to Dom Rowe, Trish Connolly, our housing peak body allies, Ivan Simon and Emma Greenhaug from NATSIA and National Shelter. But most of all, I want to acknowledge the many, many workers in the homelessness sector and people with lived experience of homelessness who are in the room or joining us online. I know that for all of you, homelessness every day is front of mind, and I want to recognise your collective dedication, your passion and your ambition to make a difference. Thank you all for getting behind Homelessness Week and coming along to the launch, and for all of those advocacy activities you'll do through the week. Each year, Homelessness Australia coordinates Homelessness Week to put homelessness on the radar of the Australian community and our policy and decision makers. So today, we're going to zoom in on family and child homelessness. And to give that some context, today Homelessness Australia released a new report, the 2024 Child Homelessness Snapshot. So I'm not going to go through all the figures in the report, but highlight just a couple. In the past year, 2022-23, homelessness services assisted more than 88,000 parents and children who came to homelessness services as a family group. At their last contact with a service, more than a third of those parents and children were still homeless. Many more were still at risk of homelessness. As anyone who works in our sector can tell you, that's because there's just no rentals that are affordable to homeless families so that they can escape homelessness. So services also assisted 76,000 homeless children. At their last contact with a service, 25,000 of those children were still homeless. Another 20,000 homeless children came to homeless services across the year and were turned away because services didn't have any support that they could provide them. These figures reflect just how overwhelmed our homelessness services are. It's not just the housing crisis, which it's bad enough, but also the unrelenting scourge of domestic and family violence. In this sector, that weight of unmet need of people who need us but who we don't have the resources to help is with us every day. It is never okay. We have to fight to make it better. So later in this event, we're going to explore the changes that are needed to end child and family homelessness with our keynote speaker, Australia's Children's Commissioner, Anne Hollonds, and a panel of dedicated community leaders. But before that, we have a very special opportunity today to welcome Australia's brand new Minister for Housing and Homelessness, the Honourable Clare O'Neil. Thank you, Minister, for taking the time to be here with us today so soon after your appointment. We have so much enthusiasm and hope about you coming to stand with us to make change. We know that to shift the dial on homelessness in Australia, we need you in Cabinet where we can't be, to be a strong and steadfast advocate. We need a leader who can engage the states in partnering to deliver change, and we need a strategist who can tackle the reforms that are needed across government to fix the causes of homelessness that sit outside your portfolio. We appreciate this is pretty challenging. You're taking on housing and homelessness portfolios in the midst of a national housing disaster. It's gone well beyond a crisis, and it's been a long time in the making. But who better to do a tough job and move mountains than a smart, passionate woman? So welcome. We have every faith, and we are right there with you to build on the work that's already begun. So I want to acknowledge the work of your predecessor, Minister Julie Collins, in getting the ball rolling. As Minister, she delivered significant new social housing investments, and she made permanent funding for homelessness services that was previously due to lapse. Those are big achievements, and they've been very welcome. But I'm confident you'll be in furious agreement with us that there's much more to do. In particular, the much-anticipated 10-year National Housing and Homelessness Plan offers a monumental opportunity to drive transformational change. As you take charge of developing this plan, we encourage you to look back at Labor legacy of the Rudd-Gillard government's The Road Home agenda, which remains universally acclaimed as Australia's high watermark in homelessness policy. The Road Home included tangible targets and measures to reduce homelessness. So that's the kind of ambition and accountability we want to see in the upcoming plan. The Road Home was also intended to be underpinned by national homelessness legislation, perhaps not dissimilar to that recently introduced as a private member's bill. And it also drove new ways of working. And some of the pilots that the Road Home funded are still in existence as demonstration projects ready for systemic adoption. So in developing the plan, we also encourage you to look elsewhere. Scotland's Ending Homelessness Together strategy is a really comprehensive strategy underpinned by ambition and targets to end homelessness. And early indicators of success in Scotland include the lowest levels of rough sleeping on record and a declining trend in repeat episodes of homelessness. So the plan is also an opportunity to look locally across Australia at the innovative contemporary models that are preventing and ending homelessness right here. There are just so many examples of amazing work done by the homelessness sector, but I want to particularly mention the importance of Housing First programs that end homelessness for people with complex needs and long histories of homelessness. While this group account for only about 10% of the people who need homelessness support, the lack of investment in the housing and the support that they need means they return again and again and ultimately end up using 40 to 50% of service capacity. So finally, in developing the plan and in all of your work to end homelessness, I urge you to lean on and learn with the homelessness sector and the people that we work with. Know that we stand ready and willing to work shoulder to shoulder with you to address the challenges and realise the opportunities ahead. Your success as Minister will be our success too. So now can I formally introduce our new Minister? Clare O'Neil was elected to Federal Parliament in 2013. She represents the electorate of Hotham in Melbourne's southeast. In 2022, Clare was appointed the Minister for Home Affairs and Minister for Cybersecurity and became a Cabinet member. During her tenure, she launched the Migration Strategy and the Cybersecurity Strategy, remaking our migration system for the 21st century and setting Australia on course to be a world leader in cybersecurity by 2030. As the recently appointed Minister for Housing and Homelessness, Clare's delivering on the government's commitment to build 1.2 million homes by the end of the decade, helping all Australians to build, rent or buy a home. And while she has a very busy schedule, she's happiest living in and exploring Melbourne's southeast with a husband, Brendan, 3 kids, 2 dogs and 4 chickens. So please, a warm welcome to the Minister for Housing and Homelessness.
No pressure, Kate. Gee, set the expectations. I love that. Thank you so much for having me. And could I just acknowledge, I think as Uncle Michael West departed, that was a beautiful welcome to country that he gave us there. I'm just constantly amazed as an Australian at the enormous generosity that our First Nations people show us, and we just saw that with Uncle Michael, and I really want to acknowledge him. I want to acknowledge that we're on Gadigal land today of the people of the Eora Nation, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and future. And I also want to acknowledge any other First Nations people who are here with us today. We've got lots of very important people in the room. The National Children's Commissioner, Anne Hollonds. Give us a little wave down there, Anne. I'm sure well known to everyone in this room. We've got the CEO of Homelessness New South Wales, Dom Rowe. Where's Dom? Over here. Dom, thank you so much for having us. We have the CEO of the YWCA Canberra, Francis Crimmins. Francis is here. Hello, Francis. And of course, Kate Colvin, who's given me that very warm introduction and a stern but welcoming set of lobbying just to get to open the bidding. I love it. So as Kate said to you here, I have been the Minister for Housing and the Minister for Homelessness for exactly a week. And someone said, oh, well, there's this event happening next Monday, of course that, you won't be able to join. And I was like, what? Are you kidding? This is a perfect opportunity for me to come and share a little bit about me, my values and what drives me in politics, and just to have the chance to meet and talk to some of you about the work that our government's done, the enormous work our government's done on housing and homelessness, and understand how I can make a contribution to that. So just a few things about me. I have been involved in politics for most of my life. I was one of those young people who was just filled with a burning rage about the injustices that I saw in the world around me. And I recognise that lots of people grow up in homes where politics and politicians are not thought of particularly kindly. I understand that. But that wasn't the household I grew up in. I was raised to believe that if you want to change your country, if you want to improve the lives of the people around you, then one of the best and fastest ways that you can do that is through politics. I've done lots of other things. I've worked in the community sector, I've worked in business, I've worked in all 3 levels of government in various different capacities, and I'm really confident. I keep leaving politics but then coming back to it because I really do believe that for me, this is where I can make the most contribution. I care deeply about my country and my community. Since I've been elected to Parliament, I've had 3 beautiful children of my own, and when I leave the house, as many mornings I do, well before they get out of bed to travel to different states around the country, I really think about them, my children, and how part of my job is to try to make their country better for them, the country that they will inherit as adults. I take my job and my work incredibly seriously. Even the people that don't particularly like me in Canberra, and there are 1 or 2, but even they would say I work incredibly hard. I'm deeply devoted to the work that I do. I love to do hard things, and often in politics I find myself inexorably drawn to the biggest challenges because that's where I can make the biggest impact. I love to work on those areas of public policy where we've got really big problems, because when we sort those problems out, we often find we can make a huge difference and make a real impact to the lives of real people. So as Kate's mentioned, I was given this portfolio exactly a week ago today. And everything I have learned about housing and homelessness since then has affirmed my ingoing belief. I do not think that there is a better place in government or in public policy today than working in housing and homelessness, because I take on these portfolios at a critical moment for our country in this area. We have 3 intertwining crises which are affecting us. We have a housing supply crisis. We literally do not have enough homes for the people who are living in our country. We have a housing affordability crisis. The homes that we do have are no longer accessible to ordinary working people. And we have a housing construction crisis, deep and difficult problems in the way that we construct homes, in the things that the materials and businesses need to put into those homes, which are slowing down housing builds at the very moment where we need to be going more quickly. So these are practical problems, but I fiercely believe, as I'm sure everyone in this room does, that housing and having a house is just not about practicalities. It's not about nuts and bolts of infrastructure. Housing is the foundation for the life experience of every citizen in our country. So the housing crisis we're in today is not just a housing crisis. It's not just a problem of bricks and mortar and nuts and bolts. This is a really deep problem for our country, which is really about what does it mean to be Australian and what are the legitimate entitlements of Australian citizens. It is about young people in our country and their legitimate expectation for the kind of adulthood that they should be allowed to have. It is about the way that wealth is distributed in our country between the generations in our country, but also the people who will inherit housing wealth and those who will not. And very relevantly for the people in this room, it is a deep question about what we are willing to do to help the most disadvantaged. And that brings us here to homelessness. Now, homelessness is going to be a pivotal part of the work that I do in this portfolio. Monday last week, I was sworn in as the Housing and Homelessness Minister at about 10 a.m. in the morning, the first opportunity that I got to get out of Parliament House and go out into the community. I went to Vinnie's Roadhouse in Canberra to talk to some workers there, 3 amazing women who spend their afternoons serving meals to people who would otherwise go without food. Since then, I've visited the Lighthouse Foundation in Melbourne, an organisation that I've had an association with for various reasons for almost my whole life. And then today I had the really incredible opportunity to go to the B. Miles Foundation to look at some of the work that's happening there and to speak to someone who's been affected over a long period of time by homelessness. I just want to share with you some of the things that I'm really learning and some of the things that I can hear that you are very keen for me to hear. One of those is that it is very obvious to me that the current big crisis that we're having in housing in Australia is feeding into our homelessness population very clearly. There is no distinction really here between the big problems we're having in the commercial housing market and the experience of people who are experiencing homelessness. All of the workers who I've talked to about this issue in the last week have talked to me about the fact that they are seeing people coming into homelessness services who would never have come through the doors 10 years ago. People who would, in any other climate, have had pretty secure housing are now finding themselves for the first time to be without it. And I want to acknowledge also just a really important message that I have got from the community in this room is that for that group of people who are recurrently experiencing homelessness, the housing is an absolutely necessary starting point for their journey to living a fulfilling and safe life in our country, but it's not the end of their journey. The housing is the foundation, but actually one of the things I've heard pretty consistently is that once someone gets a house, that's actually often when those problems that they've been trying to manage their whole life start to bubble up, and that's when they're going to need, in fact, lots of support and lots of work with us. So just sharing with you some of the things that I've learned so far. I want to join with Kate in just acknowledging the incredible work that Julie Collins was able to do in this portfolio. I know a lot of you in this room would have been involved in housing for a really long period of time, and you would have seen that for quite a number of years there, the Commonwealth had really stepped back from housing. Like, there was really not much Commonwealth involvement in housing at all. Our government has stepped right into the space, and we have done it with an absolute avalanche of policy work, which is going to have an impact. Now, I say that not because I think problem solved, we've got the policies, let's just implement them and move on. I don't see it that way at all, but I do think it's worth acknowledging that Julie has been able to get really serious investment out of the Commonwealth, serious investment that we have not seen for a long period in our country. You might have heard the $32 billion in investment that has been announced since we've been in government, and in fact more money in the last federal budget than when you put all those years of coalition budgets together. We spent more in just the last budget on housing. Now again, it's not problem solved. I just want you to see there is enthusiasm and commitment and effort from the Commonwealth Government in this space for a long time. So I just want to share with you just a few of the things that I think are most worth picking out of what's been done. You know that the federal government has worked with the states to make this commitment for 1.2 million homes in 5 years, a really ambitious target. And what sits underneath those commitments is really a dozen or so critical policies that the Commonwealth has already committed to. And one of my big jobs in this role is delivery, delivery, delivery. Now we've got that money committed, I need to make sure that that money's rolling out the door in a timely fashion. So I'm talking there about that $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund that will help deliver 30,000 new social and affordable rental homes, the $2 billion social housing accelerator. You will notice that the government's been trying to do some work with renters. I'm really, really worried about renters at the moment who are in many respects dealing with all of the big issues in our economy in their own households. And that last budget had a back-to-back increase to the Commonwealth rent assistance, the first time that's happened in 30 years, which we were really pleased about. We are doing a lot of work on trying to bring skilled workers into the country because at the end of the day, a lot of the problems that we're concerned about in this room are about the sheer number of houses, and that means we have to build more homes. We're working with the states on planning reforms that will let us make some traction there. Part of the Housing Australia Future Fund has earmarked $200 million for the repair and improvement of housing in remote First Nations communities, and also to support veterans who are experiencing homelessness. And of course, we mentioned earlier that work that had been done to extend the National Agreement on Social Housing and Homelessness, which makes permanent that $400 million a year. That's got to be matched by the states and territories. So I hope that just gives you a handful of some of the big work that's been done. This was secured by Julie through all of her hard work, and it's now for me to deliver on that and also work with you on what's next. I might just finish by saying that there's a huge task ahead of us here. And Kate, if I can just pick up on one point you made there, we can stand shoulder to shoulder on this. One of my main goals in this portfolio is to make sure that your sector gets as much public exposure and attention as possible. We need to make this a really big issue for the country, and we're going to get lots of focus and eyes on this. This is a really important moment for the housing conversation in our country. Our housing market has cracked, and we need to do some big things to make sure that not only we're addressing homelessness, but that dream of home ownership doesn't disappear for 2 generations of Australians. So we're going to raise awareness together. This has been a really good opportunity to talk to you a little bit about what the government is doing, but I'm really keen to talk to you about what's next. So I hope we'll get the opportunity this afternoon after our panel to have a bit of a discussion. So it is a huge privilege and a pleasure for me to launch Homelessness Week for 2024, and I'm really looking forward to working with you all over the coming years. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much. We've got exciting times ahead. So can I now introduce our keynote speaker, Anne Hollonds, Australia's National Children's Commissioner. An expert in children's welfare, the Commissioner was formerly Director of the Australian Institute of Family Studies, before which she spent 23 years as the CEO of government and non-government organisations focused on research, policy and practice in child and family wellbeing. Anne has also worked in frontline practice as a psychologist and practiced in child protection, domestic and family violence, mental health, child and family counselling, parenting education and family law counselling, and currently contributes to several expert advisory groups, including the Family Law Council, Australian Child Maltreatment Study, New South Wales Domestic and Family Violence and Sexual Assault Council, National Plan Advisory Group and Early Years Strategy Advisory Panel. And I think it's really exciting because we often talk about things in silos, to be thinking about the way homelessness touches on all of those other areas. So please, a warm welcome to the National Children's Commissioner, Anne Hollonds.
Thanks, Kate, for the lovely warm welcome and for the opportunity to share some reflections this morning. And thank you to Uncle Michael for his great welcome to country, and I pay my respects also to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nations and to all First Nations people who are joining us today, online, wherever you are, or here in the room. Acknowledge the Honourable Clare O'Neil, our new Minister for Housing and Homelessness, and and acknowledge the work that's already been done that you've outlined for us this morning, which is substantial. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge all of you who are working so hard to help children, young people, adults, families every single day. It's lovely to see a few familiar faces. I spent most of my career in the NGO sector and have crossed paths with some of you along the way. To start on a positive note, we know that housing and homelessness is a key priority for National Cabinet and that the national plan is under construction. This is excellent because the federation structure that we have in this country makes policy very complicated, as we were chatting about earlier. And in particular, when it comes to children and young people, policy is scattered widely across different ministries and portfolios and across the jurisdictions. It's often, I feel like it's someone's taken a bag of seeds and just flung them like this. And that's children's policy for you. With housing and homelessness, it makes sense that we should all work together as a federation and for this to be a key priority for National Cabinet. The bad news is that we're now scrambling to catch up after a long period of neglect that has left a trail of disadvantage and harm to children and young people who have had no safe place to live. Now, many of them are parents themselves, and we can see the cycle of disadvantage repeating. Poverty is a key part of this story, along with other complex needs like mental health issues, disabilities, learning problems, and of course child maltreatment. And stable housing is a core anchor point from which everything required to meet the needs of children hangs. As National Children's Commissioner, my focus is on the human rights of children and young people. Housing is a human right of children under Article 27 of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, which Australia signed in 1990, alongside the other basic necessities of life such as food and clothing. They're all in Article 27. A safe and stable home is much more than just the four walls. When asked about what home means, children will often talk about the concept of home to them means the stability and security of their most important relationships, especially in the family. This is where safe and stable housing comes in. It is the foundation for the conditions that enable the child to get their needs met, especially through family relationships, but also through the local community that they're living in, such as their friends and teachers at school, and through community activities like sport. In contrast, the transient and marginalised life that homelessness brings serves to rob the child not only of a roof over their head, but the stable relationships that they need for their health, learning, development and well-being. The impact on children of the stress affecting their parents and caregivers has been well documented. Homelessness robs children of the core elements of their childhood. I know that in Australia we can do a lot better than this. We've all enjoyed seeing Australia's tally recently of medals in the Olympics. But on child wellbeing, we rank a low 32nd out of 38 OECD countries on child wellbeing, right near the bottom. And that's just one indicator that we're failing on when it comes to children's policy. We saw last week the Productivity Commission showing that we're going backwards on key indicators, especially those key indicators for children. We saw the Mission Australia Youth Survey last week, again showing that not only the high rates of homelessness, but that 2 out of 5 had missed out on the basics, such as not only housing, but food, clothing, school and transport. And your research today, Kate, shows extraordinary numbers of children homeless, including unaccompanied children, seeking help but not getting the help that they need. Young people have unique challenges accessing housing, and those who don't have parents or family to support them, such as young people who are leaving out-of-home care or those in the justice system, they need our help to get a place to live. Instead, we wait and wait and wait. This is what kids tell me. We wait until there's a crisis or a crime has been committed before we act in some way. And often the way we act is inadequate or inappropriate, causes more harm, or it's just way too late. A safe and stable home is like the anchor point from which the other needs can start to be met. One of several protective factors, like engagement at school, stable housing is foundational, and without it the precariousness and risk factors mount up. It's like the canary in the mine, an early warning sign. Without stable housing, you're likely to have a range of other complex risk factors that escalate as the child moves through their childhood. These are the children we see in our overwhelmed child protection and justice systems. Children from backgrounds of domestic, family and sexual violence, poverty and homelessness. I've just spent a year working on a report on youth justice reform that's going to be tabled in Parliament next month by the Attorney-General. And it's well known that kids who end up committing crimes often have no safe home. And that's why 97% of them are held in detention on remand. They haven't been sentenced. They're held on remand because there's no safe place for them to be bailed to. Now, this is a fact that a lot of the Australian community would not understand, and it's directly linked to the housing and homelessness disaster, as Kate called it. I was privileged to speak to about 150 of these kids from around Australia. 70% of them were First Nations kids, and I thought I had seen it all at the end of this project until I found that in some parts of Australia, kids who are leaving detention are being given a tent because there's nowhere for them to live. Domestic, family and sexual violence, which from now on I'll just call DFSV, it's way too long, it plays a key role in homelessness, and as we now understand it, DFSV is much more prevalent than we thought. Unfortunately, children as victims survivors of DFSV have been largely overlooked in policy, despite the fact that the groundbreaking Australian child maltreatment study showed that DFSV is the most common form of child maltreatment and that it usually goes together with other types of child maltreatment. And the study also found that over 62% of Australians have suffered one or more form of child maltreatment, much more than we thought. But because child safety and well-being is not a national policy priority, children are often overlooked. The outcome of children and young people not being a national priority the outcomes are real and tangible. I'll just give you one example. When National Cabinet had its emergency meeting on women's safety in May, you'll all remember that period. It was in the media every single day. There was an announcement about the escaping violence payment, but that's not available to kids under 18. Many of these teenagers have children of their own already, and they're reliant on couch surfing with random people or in short-term refuges or in caravan parks. These young people tell me they are forced into couch surfing with young babies as their only option to escape violence, placing themselves and their young children at further risk of harm and continuing the problems on to the next generation. While women and women's safety is a key priority for National Cabinet, child safety and well-being is not. In all of my consultations around Australia, I've been shocked at how a lack of stable housing is a key risk factor for children and young people, and I've done many of these consultations now. In one of them, it's called Keeping Kids Safe and Well, I asked, what helps to keep children and young people safe and well, and what makes it hard to keep children safe and well? And in response to these very broad and not leading questions, again and again housing came up, alongside the other basics, food, clothing and transport. I heard from children that they worry about their family members who can't get help for mental health issues, drug and alcohol, domestic and family and sexual violence. And we know that there's a serious lack of those services, especially for young people themselves. I heard that children want to go to school, but they don't feel safe there and they don't feel they belong at school. And if a child's not at school, where are they? Well, they're likely to be on the streets trying to meet that very normal need for belonging with other kids on the streets, and they get involved with negative behaviours. These kids want, and their families want, help for complex problems from the same place for different family members, and they want service providers who listen to them and whom they can trust. You see, all these things are interconnected, and together the failure of these systems, especially health, education and social services, the fragmentation and the lack of coordination across the silos means we're not able to provide the scaffolding children need. Our federation structure means that our most vulnerable children sit awkwardly at the intersection of portfolios and jurisdictions, and these kids are falling through the gaps. Our most vulnerable children are victims of federation failure. Child and youth homelessness is a preventable problem of our own making and an indictment of a rich and developed country in 2024. Internationally, there are other examples of how to fix this. I think Kate talked about Scotland. I looked up Housing First in Finland because I happen to be born in Finland, and I saw on their website they call it a human rights-based strategy. What does this mean? It means the policy on housing is anchored in human rights principles, as expressed in many of the international conventions that Australia has signed up to. The objective of this program in Housing First is to reduce reliance on short-term accommodation in crises in favour of long-term, and in Finland, just one country, they saw a dramatic decrease of 68% in long-term homelessness. It makes a lot of sense to start to look at housing in a completely different way. We need to transform our approach. By the way, I think it's no coincidence that Finland is also one of the countries that has legislated to incorporate the Convention of the Rights of the Child into law, unlike Australia, where we have not. The joint submission by the National Coalition to End Child and Youth Homelessness, many of you are probably here who are a part of that coalition, I don't know if you are. Fabulous submission to the issues paper last year. I'm going to quote that submission because I think they said it really well, and I hope some of you are here. While the NHHA, another acronym, Minister, includes children and young people as a priority cohort, this has not translated into comprehensive plans or actions by the state and territory governments to address child and youth homelessness. And unaccompanied homeless children are not identified as a priority cohort at all in that agreement. This submission also notes youth homelessness cannot be solved without housing, but youth homelessness cannot be solved with housing alone. The submission makes a strong case for a standalone national plan to address child and youth homelessness, which I back completely. And notes all of the recommendations from inquiries going back to the 1970s that have not been implemented. Okay. We need leaders today who have the courage to say that we've gone about these problems the wrong way, that we're waiting too long before we provide any help to children and their families, and we need to look to the evidence to address the underlying causes of these problems, which go to the failure of the upstream systems that are unable to meet the needs, the complex needs of these kids and their families. Many people have said to me that currently we have an epidemic of unmet needs. And a lot of these systems like health and education, they're designed kind of in mid-last century design modes, and we're not listening enough to what kids and families say they need today. We need to redesign those systems. Addressing harms to children early on is the hidden opportunity to prevent later life problems like violence against adult women and other crimes. This is based on solid research over decades. And other problems like mental health and drug and alcohol issues and homelessness. It seems obvious to me that child safety and wellbeing should be a national priority with bipartisan commitment so that we can work together as a federation on redesigning our upstream systems to address these complex problems. It would be better for these children and their families, but clearly better for the whole community. So finally, in Australia, we like to think of ourselves as human rights champions when we kind of talk about other countries internationally. But we have a very poor understanding of the relevance of human rights internally. And in Parliament, we sometimes hear reference to women's rights, workers' rights, consumer rights, but you will never hear children's rights mentioned by political leaders in question time. And I know because I'm one of those nerds that tries to listen to question time, and I look for it. I would have heard it. Or you never hear children's rights talked about newsreaders on the news. I think we feel awkward and uncomfortable, and the term children's rights just doesn't roll off the tongue in this country. This is in contrast to other countries with similar Westminster government systems like Scotland, which has in fact incorporated the Convention of the Rights of the Child into legislation in full. A human rights lens is not mysterious or legalistic. It's a practical tool like a compass to guide our decision making. Currently, our key barrier to implementing evidence-based reform from decades of Royal Commissions and inquiries is the lack of accountability mechanisms when it comes to policy for children. So here's what I think we can do. There's some practical things, and some I think can be done with a stroke of a pen. A cabinet minister for children, just like we've had ministers for women, I think since the Whitlam years. We need to make child safety and wellbeing a national cabinet priority, and we need a ministerial council on child wellbeing. I think we also need a national act for children, legislation that would sit alongside a Human Rights Act, similar to what's done in other countries like England and New Zealand, just to mention two. Business as usual doesn't work because children are not our priority and they're sidelined always in favour of the concerns that adults have when it comes to policy. And I've been told directly by several MPs, champions for children, when I ask them, why have we made so little progress, really through my career, very little progress, I've been told there's no votes in children, directly. There's no votes in children. And because there is no one in Cabinet actually responsible for child wellbeing, it means the advocacy community, all of us, has to deal separately with every single minister in every portfolio and across in all the jurisdictions, to try to bring to their attention the unique needs of children and young people. Despite all of this, I remain optimistic that Australia can be a great place to be a child, but we are not there yet. We need, I think, to all pull together, whatever your particular advocacy focus is, pull together with one voice for children and young people. Currently, we're fragmented and we're mirroring the fragmentation in the policy landscape. I congratulate all of you on your advocacy, and I back your calls for a national plan to end child and youth homelessness in order to elevate to greater visibility and accountability and urgency the unique needs of children and young people. So let's make some noise this Homelessness Week, and thank you very much for having me here today.
Thanks so much, Anne, and there's so much there, but can I just particularly the point about children's rights, note that in the UK, when we have visitors from the UK, they're always really shocked that children would end up on the street here because they have a right to homelessness services and are quickly picked up and responded to because of that right. So that's certainly something that we could work towards. So now it's time for a panel discussion, and can I introduce Dom Rowe, the CEO of Homelessness New South Wales, who's going to facilitate today's panel. Before joining Homelessness New South Wales last year, Dom worked in executive roles for Greenpeace, the National Tertiary Education Union and the Australian Council of Trade Unions, and much more. Dom has a strong personal commitment to ending homelessness and has already had a fantastic impact on the funding and policy debate around housing and homelessness in New South Wales. So Dom, over to you.
amazingly, I dropped my mic before I came up. It shows you the sort of person I am. I'd like to thank the Honourable Clare O'Neil and Hollonds for speaking wonderfully about some of the issues facing us in housing and homelessness across Australia. There's a big recognition that actually we're in crisis at the moment, and that crisis is widespread and is starting to find other parts of the community that previously were totally immune to some of the challenges of homelessness and housing. Everyone in Australia deserves a secure and safe home. They also need an affordable home. And what we're finding is numbers of us are starting to fall into the categories that are just failing to hit the mark when it comes to housing and are falling into homelessness. We see that with young people across the country, young people who should definitely have a safe and secure home. And when they don't have one, they have lifelong challenges that they have to meet that otherwise they would not have had to have met. So a safe and secure home, a real right to that across the country. And it shouldn't matter what colour you are, and it shouldn't matter what experience you have, and it shouldn't matter what wealth you have. You deserve that right to a safe and secure home. There are over 120,000 people that are homeless in Australia at the moment. And when we say 120,000 people that are homeless, we know that that is just the tip of the iceberg, because homelessness is something that's often hidden, where people are not able to ask for help, ask for support, get help, get support when they need it. And so they do amazing things to try and survive in a society that doesn't help people in that situation. Australia is one of the wealthiest nations in the world, and we should be able to give people that right to housing. But we really struggle to do that. Why is that? What is wrong with our policy settings? What's wrong with our political will that you find that people are really struggling with that in Australia? In New South Wales, we've had some good announcements in recent times. So we've seen an increase in funding for social housing, which is excellent. But we still have 57,000 households on the wait list. And that's people that are waiting years to get a safe home, years that they shouldn't have to wait, and they're being forced into places that they shouldn't be. They're forcing costs onto our society that they shouldn't be having to force onto our society. We need to invest far more in social housing in this country. There was a time not so long ago, in fact, in the memory of many of the people sitting here today and online today, where we had a third of our homes were social homes, where you could be guaranteed a proper house if you were a citizen, and even if you weren't a citizen. For those poor people that aren't citizens at the moment, they really don't get much help at all when it comes to housing and homelessness. And so if we had a third of our homes being social homes, we would have a private rental market that would actually function far better than it does today, because it would mean thousands of people would be guaranteed that right and not have to be fighting for it on the private rental market. I don't know how many of you are renters here, but I'm going to raise this one because often we talk about the unaffordability of housing. In my local area, in the space of 12 years, a three-bedroom house has gone up from 1.6 million to 3.8 million. And I say that because that means that most of the people in this room and most of the people online just simply can't afford a house in Australia anymore, and that's leaving more and more people on the scrap heap. Rents across the country have gone up, but in New South Wales they've gone up by 39% in 5 years. And again, I would challenge all of us to think how many of us have had a pay rise of 39% in 5 years. That's just not happening. And so we need really courageous and bold interventions in our housing market if we're going to make sure that people have their right to a home, a safe and secure home. I want to just acknowledge those people that work in homelessness services online and in the room. And I want to thank you for your service to our community. You are doing extraordinarily hard work, surrounded by trauma and surrounded by challenge, surrounded by a lack of resources, yet you're doing extraordinarily well to help piece people together and help them sort of lift to the next point of survival. In New South Wales, 68,500 people approached homelessness services for help and assistance. But what's even scarier than that is that the workers in homelessness services had to turn away 1 in 2 people when they're at their most desperate. We know that if we improve our services and if we improve our housing, then that's going to mean great things for our society. We know people are going to feel safe and secure just like their housing. We know that they're going to have better healthcare outcomes so that they'll live longer and happier than otherwise. And we know that in terms of justice costs, they're going to be reduced. And finally, important for our young people, we know that child protection costs are going to be reduced if we have proper housing and homelessness services so that people get the help they need. With that, I think there's good news on the horizon. We're starting to see a constellation of forces that really want to fix this crisis. We have ministers like Clare O'Neil that are coming in. We've got ministers like Rose Jackson that are serious about trying to address the challenges that Australians face. And that's a really good sign. We're starting to see more investment in a range of places. There was $500 million invested into homelessness services in the state budget. That's an extraordinary investment. We're very happy for it. We need more, as I'm sure you will all agree. But it was a step in the right direction. People are starting to listen and understand the scale of the crisis that we're going through in our communities. And with that, I'm going to introduce a colleague of mine who always speaks fantastically, and that's John Leha, and he's from AbSec. AbSec is the peak body for Aboriginal Children's and Family Services. It does extraordinary work in our communities across New South Wales. But I'm going to invite John to come and give a speech.
Hello. I thought I was joining a panel, but I'll give a speech. All good. What is there not to say? I think the Minister and Anne have pretty much summarised some of the key drivers behind homelessness and housing and the intersection between child protection. Firstly, I'll probably also want to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people and pay my respects, and I say that as the Director of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council. But also thank you to Homelessness Australia in New South Wales for partaking in that traditional custom. I think really today I was invited to have this yarn really around what are the intersections and how housing and homelessness is actually driving the overrepresentation of Aboriginal children in child protection systems, and it is continuing to do so. And that a lot of the work of the Minister and the government over most recent years has now, we've seen a trickle effect come into the jurisdiction where we're seeing investment into housing stock, which is critical and is needed. I think what we don't really acknowledge is that in some of the barriers that the Commissioner had highlighted is also the impact of racism. So easily we talk about the impacts of colonisation as if it's something that happened in the past, but actually don't acknowledge that it is the ongoing perpetuation of colonisation and the impact of racism at all levels that is driving the overrepresentation of children and families that are being faced with homelessness. When we're asking those families to take advantage of a private housing market that sometimes might be blessed enough to afford, but then to be faced with racism, where they're not actually being given a house that they've been waiting for, or the impacts of tourism industries across regional parts of New South Wales where housing stock isn't available, and where traditional families living on country can't even afford to live on their own country because they're competing with sectors, be it housing, be it government infrastructure being built in certain regions. Those types of instances continue to impact on the lives of Aboriginal people. It also should be acknowledged that it is a right and a universal right for Aboriginal people to be able to live, work and have a life on their own country, and for those children to also partake in that community and on that country and to continue to live prosperous lives in such a way. But what we do acknowledge, and rightfully so, Dom acknowledges the cost, rising costs of housing stock, where we're potentially seeing cities, major cities and areas, regional developments, actually not account for the rights of Indigenous people to live on their own lands, in their own communities, to practice culture and to raise their children on country. Michael's ability to be able to partake and to live on country and service community is a privilege, one that is continuing to escape us if we do not actively address housing, and particularly the role of housing when it comes to sustaining Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal community control sector. And I acknowledge the Aboriginal community control sector as a cornerstone of Aboriginal communities. They're the people that employ us for and by Aboriginal people. They're also, Aboriginal community controlled organisations are leading the ways for closing the gap. We're not just saying these are the issues, we're putting our hands up saying we've also got the solutions, but it does mean that systems need to be have an appetite to transform themselves. It means that we've got to acknowledge that what we've currently had isn't good enough and that we need to do better. It does mean that we need to continue to bolster behind Aboriginal community controlled responses to many of the issues and the targets under closing the gap, but also housing and homelessness and how we can better support those individuals and those families with early they say early interventions, but I've got an issue with intervention for obvious reasons. But to replace that with investments, early investments and prevention. It's about not identifying an issue or a problem at a point in time where a family is, at a critical point where they're potentially coming at risk, but saying this isn't a point for saying identifying risk and removing and providing and adding more stress to you. It's about identifying the issue and being able to invest in that family and that child to continue to be able to be housed in a sustainable home for them to continue to live a prosperous life. Those things don't happen by accident. That happens because we have conversations about them and that we lean in to those conversations where needed and that we are actively taking steps to ensure that they're not being left to the whims or the ill intent, to the good intent of policymakers, but ensuring that those policymakers are listening to communities first and foremost, and that those communities have the opportunity to really design and be a part of the responses to those challenges. But I think that pretty much, I wanted to stop there because it was only supposed to be a couple of minutes, but to really push the need for Aboriginal people to have the rights of Indigenous people across the world to live on their own lands and to not be pushed out because of the costs of living or a rising market rate, that we need strategic plans and action items to ensure that cities like Sydney, the biggest city and the place of colonisation, is ensuring that Aboriginal people can afford to live on these lands to continue to provide the diversity that we have all come to know what is Australia and what we all recognise and appreciate that we want to continue to have moving forward. So that's all I've got for you in terms of the intersections of child protection and how housing can continue to actually be a solution to addressing issues of child protection and/or abuse and neglect, but also how we can tackle poverty and ensuring that those families are able to be provided sustainable homes to provide a living for their family. All right, I'll shush. Thank you very much for having me.
John?
Oh, I am taking a seat. Okay.
John is showing his incredible flexibility at this point. Much appreciated. I think that was quite a powerful speech and really looked at the intersection of various systems in our society that are creating unjust outcomes. So thank you for that, John. Much appreciated. With that, I would like to warmly welcome Francis Crimmins to the stage, who's the CEO of YWCA in Canberra. Can't get that one wrong. I've known Frances for a little while now. She's been incredibly welcoming to new people in the sector, but also has a great deal of wisdom that she often shows as chair of the Homelessness Australia board. With that, I'd like to welcome Frances to the stage.
Thank you so much, Dom. I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land upon which we're meeting and gathering today, the Gadigal people, and I really would like to acknowledge Uncle Michael for that beautiful welcome to country, and that you are continually teaching us what we should have been taught in school. Sadly, that wasn't part of my education when I grew up as a child in this country. This land was never surrendered and was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I've been asked to provide, and I will keep it brief because I know we're going on a lot in terms of timekeeping, but I've been asked to provide some comments about ending homelessness for women and children who are survivors of domestic, family and sexual violence. Indeed, this is no small topic. And it's one that is often found mentioned alongside words like complex, challenging, and intractable. But this isn't unsolvable or an inevitable problem. Domestic, family, and sexual violence is the leading co-presenting factor when women with children seek housing and homelessness assistance. And in March this year, Homelessness Services provided support to 26,000 women whose need for urgent housing support co-presented with domestic, family and sexual violence. And these services also supported a similar number of clients aged between 0 and 17 years of age. Now, we were proud today at Homelessness Australia to share and bring the attention of our Children Homelessness Snapshot report that I recommend you all have a look. The numbers in there are very sobering. And as mentioned by the Commissioner, you'd be aware of Mission Australia's report that was released last week, where nearly 1 in 10 young people aged 15 to 19 who completed their youth survey faced homelessness in the past 12 months. For the 52,000 people aged between 15 and 24 who accessed homelessness services in 2023, more than a third had escaped violence in their own home. If violence at home is a leading cause of homelessness among women, children and young people, a safe home must be part of the answer to their homelessness. Research into the intersection between domestic, family and sexual violence and homelessness reveals that what many of us in the sector have known, that those living with violence face a miserable choice: poverty or more violence. Just as the definition of homelessness in Australia doesn't always mean rooflessness, returning to a place of violence because there is no other housing alternatively is quite simply another form of homelessness. We must start conceptualising living with domestic, family and sexual violence as a form of homelessness in and of itself. And homelessness must not be allowed to become an inevitable outcome of domestic, family and sexual violence. The Australian Government's Safer Place model of $100 million initiative, which our organisation received funding under, does provide desperately needed new funding to support housing for this uniquely vulnerable cohort. So our own Safer Places accommodation, which we opened in December, has already turned over some clients twice in the first 8 months of operation. And in that short time, we were able to provide vital stepping stones between living in crisis and establishing safety. Due to the second round of Safer Places funding, we are soon to have 2 family-sized homes for women with children who are leaving violence. Now, I know the cost of that may look a lot, but let me tell you, it's a lot more affordable than housing women and children in motels. We need to stop the trauma, and if you're in survival mode and we put you in a hotel, we know the length of stays in motels is growing longer and longer. It is not a place you can recover or commence recovering with your children. So I encourage further investment in safer places accommodation for us to have a standalone home where a mother with 6 children can choose to furnish it themselves, work with our staff, make that look like a home from day one. The difference that makes to those children and young people is just heartwarming to see, to make them actually feel like they belong in this community, and this is a home that can be their home until they are ready to move on. We need to put the agency back into their hands. As I said, these homes are life-changing. And so are the specialist women's services like our own. So a big shout out to the other specialists, women's homeless services, which deliver this support. I know, along with us, you rise to the challenge of providing judgment-free and a trauma-informed service that are unique to each individual and child that comes into your service. But we need more money to support the children. Every child needs to be treated and have the funding to provide support for that child, not just the mother. If violence at home, sorry, that ends, I repeated myself. So as I said, safe homes, a professional and thriving women's specialist sector and a strong policy reform agenda are intrinsic to ending the age-old trajectory of violence to homelessness. Thank you.
Thanks, Frances. That was really interesting to hear, and particularly about some of the programs that you're operating in your area or neck of the woods. We're going to have a little panel discussion now from some pretty amazing speakers that you've heard from across the day. And I thought we might start, because I thought, Anne, you mentioned some really interesting things in your speech, particularly around children's rights or human rights and how we frame that. And I was interested if you had any advice for the crowd about how we might pursue that as a particular pathway for making sure children are appropriately respected and also sort of dealt with over time.
Well, it's kind of a tough question, Dom. Thank you. But I think at its core, first of all, we need to educate ourselves about the relevance of human rights and a human rights lens to solving our biggest problems in this country. Because I think, and I'm not, by the way, I'm not a human rights lawyer. I don't have a human rightsy background like the other people at the Human Rights Commission. There's plenty of them there. That wasn't me. I came from, I was a child protection worker. I came from the front line. I worked in NGOs my whole career. So it's been a bit of a learning for me. But how I understand it is that human rights are a tool that we can use to help make better decisions, right? And I think that a lot of policymakers in Canberra and probably in the states and territories too, I deal with mostly the ones in Canberra, I think they're a little bit nervous about the idea. And when I'm on a panel for some kind of a new strategy, and I suggest they might put they might refer to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, often I find they don't know where to put it, or they don't know what to do with it. I think there is a sort of a fundamental lack of understanding and a lot of learning, a lot of educating ourselves that we need to do. And I'm very empathic about that. I mean, I understand because I've gone through that journey myself. So that's the first thing I'd say, is that, read the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the other relevant conventions, understand what's in there, and then when you're doing your advocacy, you can draw on them to say, well, actually, this is not pie in the sky. This is just basically what we signed up to. In the case of the Children's Rights Convention, we signed up in 1990, and that does bring some responsibilities to ensure that the human rights of children. By the way, I talk about the human rights of children now because children's rights no one feels comfortable with. But if you call it the human rights of children, I get maybe 10 seconds more attention because we kind of like the idea of human rights. But seriously, I think the more that we can be ourselves in our advocacy using a rights-based framework, the more it becomes, we're comfortable with it. It's not something that's the purview of the Human Rights Commission alone. It's everybody's business, and it is relevant to making better decisions in policy and legislation.
And I'm interested too, Frances, because there's sort of a rights component of family and domestic violence, but particularly interested in some of the solutions that you've been seeing coming up in the space which you operate in, and how what you think of those. Are they particularly useful, or do you think more needs to be done, or where do you think those are at?
So we primarily house women with children, and we certainly need to see the better outcomes when we're able to, as I said, house women and their children in a home. And a traditional shelter, particularly with children, can sometimes cause more harm. And so the work that we've been able to do by providing beautifully made homes, we opened, the ones we opened in December were architecturally designed, beautiful 2-bedroom homes sitting in a beautiful part of Canberra that you wouldn't know, that they just look like a home. And that's how it should be, that the joy the staff told me when they were able to take the first families who were living there, they said they could nearly feel the relief when they walked in to brand new, beautifully modest but appropriate, with a place for children, a place you can have a pet. Remember, pets are really important family members too. But to also know that your support person at that time was there for as long as you need. So that's what we need to see more investment in, that it is a place that you can stay in for as long as you need, that isn't falling to bits. Some of the homes that we have in the public housing system are quite frankly shameful. And we have women with children who take one look and say, I can't house my children in there. We've been handing them back to the government because it's simply not acceptable to have a home that is rat infested with black mould. We had a woman who was put in a new home, or an older home, recarpeted, and on Christmas Day, they'd been there 2 weeks, she fell through the rotting floor because the person who was fixing it just put it on and didn't tell us that the floorboards were rotten. Now, the trauma that caused that woman, re-caused her after 2 weeks of finding a safe space, was unspeakable. So that's what we need to see investment in. And yes, motels might seem a short-term alternative, but they're not. The harm that they can do if you cannot move somebody within 1 to 2 days into a safe home, it's really important that we have those homes to move people urgently from that decision that you make. Because when you leave with your children, the unknown is often more fearful than staying with the known.
It's absolutely disgraceful. I can only imagine when you think you're safe and you're actually not in the right place at the right time. It's interesting, in New South Wales, they're looking at shifting away from hotel and motel accommodation to try and give people a sort of longer term option while they can start to heal. Not fully heal, but start to heal that process. I'm interested, Frances, in your area again, what prevention there is, because we often talk about the crisis end of the homelessness system. I think many of us sort of talk about that when we're explaining things to people. I just wondered what prevention you've seen in your area that you think has the chance of working or you think should be further invested in.
So we hear a lot of talk about prevention working with children and young people, but actually for us prevention starts with working with a woman where we can, when they feel that they need support. I would like to acknowledge the great work of Jess Hill and Dr. Micah Salter in this area and recommend their paper to you on what we should be looking at for prevention in this space. I think We need to start working with and have safe spaces for men who use violence as well, but in particular the prevention work with children and families. Prevention could be something as engaging a child in 0 to 5 straight into a early learning centre. A quality early learning centre can start that prevention work with that child. And that's something that our team work really closely with, is to connect children back into early education and or schooling is really important to start that work with them. A lot of women disclose to us that they fear that their own children are going to either become victims or sadly perpetrators. So that's where we need to start working early with prevention with children. And again, the investment in support and therapeutic services for children must go hand in hand with the support for the mother.
Definitely early. And John, you talked about early investment in our children and young people being a way that prevention could happen. Could you tell us a little bit more about the way you see prevention happening?
I'd also probably reiterate your points, Francis, in regards to the investment into the family. It is critical. For those in child protection, we acknowledge there are not enough carers to take up the influx of children coming into care, and that prevention in its most fundamental stage is an investment into the family, into the mother and the father, to be able to provide sustainable and a safe home. In terms of prevention, those types of wraparound services, parenting classes, be it budgeting programs or whatever it may be that child protection agencies are providing, should and will continue to do so. But I think where the gold lies is the coordination of services, wraparound services with homelessness services, child protection agencies, Aboriginal medical services, education, a holistic response to those issues that families are being faced by is what's required. I think that lack of coordination continues to allow families and children to fall in the cracks, not just in the legislative or policy platform, but in the most fundamental stages of service design and delivery, more so. Go for it.
Can I have a go on that?
Yeah.
Yeah, look, am I on? Am I on? Yep. I agree with you completely, and I know that our political leaders don't like the kind of complexity that you're talking about, John. I understand that it sounds complex, it sounds too hard, but at the bottom line, all you're talking about is better coordination, recognising that the needs of these kids and families don't sit within one portfolio, they sit in all the portfolios. And so if you're actually going to make a difference, you've got to get the portfolios working better together. You've got to harness everybody together to go, what is it that these kids need and their families? And by the way, I've for a long time promoted, the idea of systems reform, but I think sometimes even that term is kind of obscuring what we're really talking about. All systems reform is about understanding the needs of children and their families, in this case, and designing the service systems to meet those needs. It's always anchored in the needs of kids. And I think there's a general lack of understanding. I don't think we know much about child development out in the world. So as well as human rights, we need to learn about child development. And we need to understand what kids need at different stages of their development. And that's part of meeting their needs. And then finally, I just add listening. Listening to the children, young people and their families. Listening to how they want to be helped. Because we tend to make a lot of assumptions about what's good, especially for kids. We as adults know what's good for kids, and we don't take the time to listen.
I'm now going to be a little cheeky because I'm aware that the minister's in the room, and this is a question I ask whenever I visit a homelessness service of any staff member that I come into contact with, and that is, if there was one thing you could change, and it could be anything, that you think would have a good impact on homelessness, what would that be?
Starting with me.
Sure.
In addition to housing?
I thought you were going to ask the minister then.
Ask the minister, yeah. It's actually more funding to have more qualified support staff to work with women and children when they come into the service. and for the funding to have flexibility for that family's needs. So when that family is ready to engage, it's their decision when they come in and come out of our support service system.
Yep.
And so the funding has to be flexible to allow that, and to inform policymakers that crisis isn't 3 months long.
Thanks, Francis. John?
I'd probably say more investment in the housing stock. Great achievement to have done what they've done in such a very short time. But I think for us to unpack what we are seeing, generations of children being raised out of houses, it means that it needs a generational response. So an ongoing commitment to that. But obviously understanding the intersectionality of Aboriginal people and how we address that in major cities such as Sydney or any of the others across the country, and how we can address what I see is not just gentrification but assimilation policy version 2, where Aboriginal people are being forced to further out because we can't afford to live in cities. It's a repeat of history unless we intervene and unless we say that that's not a society that we think is acceptable, that poor people need to continue to move out and everybody that can afford to stay gets to stay. Well, that's not a society that I think that most Australians are looking to be a part of. So continue to do what you're doing. I think they're doing a great job, but again, greater investment over a longer period of time is what will address what I see as a systemic issue of the impacts of colonisation.
So the question again, what would make the biggest difference?
Yeah, one thing to change.
One thing to change. Well, I agree, ditto. But I'll go high and I'll say that I've formed the view that, we've all been working really hard for a long time on all of these issues. I actually don't think, I think we'll still, the bad news is if we don't get real change, we'll be here in 10 years having the same conversation. This is what frightens me the most. And I've formed the view that the only way to get real change is to elevate child safety and wellbeing to be a national priority. That means that whatever government's in power, that we have, and that should be underpinned by legislation and by it being a national priority for the Federation through a national cabinet. If we don't have those accountability mechanisms, we can just keep talking, right? I actually think we need to have those accountability mechanisms in place, and that to me is the key focus in terms of addressing the barriers to evidence-based action. There are barriers that they are the elephants in the room that we often don't talk about, and they're the reasons why the good ideas don't get listened to, don't get implemented properly and so on. And after the crisis sort of leaves the front pages of the paper and goes into abeyance, then we forget. We're not pursuing sustained change. So I think it's the accountability mechanisms within government itself that are currently missing.
Thanks, Anne. With that, we might leave the panel there, but thank you very much, Anne, John and Francis, for your very wonderful comments.
Thanks so much. Thanks to Dom for chairing the panel and for helping to organise the event. Thanks so much to Anne for coming along to be our keynote speaker. Really appreciate that. Thanks to John and Francis for your excellent contributions. That was, there's just so much richness there, and it's also just so important when we're talking about ending homelessness to be reaching beyond our own sector and talking about child and family wellbeing as well. So I really appreciate that. And thanks so much to the Minister for so generously coming all the way to Sydney and for your comments today. I feel so excited about this next period where we're going to get this done. And also, lastly, thanks to everyone in the homelessness sector and in all of our allies. Maintain the rage, take everything that you've heard, everything that you do every day, go and talk to your MP, be active on socials. It's only by really demanding the change that we need that we'll get there. So you do great work, but let's take it to the next level. And also, lastly, thanks so much to Kate from B Miles for responding to the call on Thursday and organising a visit today for the Minister. Really appreciated that. That was a really great opportunity. So thanks all, and we'll end it there. And there's some food in the for those of us who are here in the room. Thanks to everyone who's joined online. We'll end it for the online audience now, and everyone here come and have a chat and a snack. Thank you.